In the autumn of 1941, the German army took more prisoners than it knew what to do with. The summer campaigns on the Eastern Front had produced encirclements on a scale that had no precedent in the history of modern warfare. At Kiev in September, more than 600,000 Soviet soldiers surrendered in a single operation. At Bryansk and Vyazma in October, another 600,000 followed. The numbers were so large that they strained the organizational capacity of the Wehrmacht to process, contain, and supply them, which was, in the event, not much of a strain, because the Wehrmacht had not planned to process, contain, or supply them in any meaningful sense. The Soviet Union had not signed the Geneva Convention of 1929. This was the legal framework within which German policy toward Soviet prisoners was constructed. The convention established minimum standards for the treatment of prisoners of war: food, shelter, medical care, the right not to be compelled to perform dangerous labor, protection from violence and reprisals. Germany had signed it, Britain had signed it, France had signed it, the United States had signed it. The Soviet Union had not, on the grounds that no Red Army soldier would surrender, and therefore no provision for Soviet prisoners needed to be made. The Germans took this as permission. In March 1941, months before the invasion began, the Wehrmacht High Command had issued directives that removed the standard protections from Soviet prisoners. Political commissars were to be shot upon capture. Soldiers taken in areas where partisans operated could be treated as partisans themselves. The distinction between combatant and civilian, between prisoner and enemy, that the laws of war had spent decades establishing, was, on the Eastern Front, formally abolished before the first shot was fired. The result was visible in the camps, the open fields surrounded by wire, without shelter, without adequate food, without medical attention, that the Wehrmacht established behind the front lines in the autumn of 1941. The men in those fields died at rates that were not incidental but structural. They died because the system that held them had not been designed to keep them alive. By February 1942, less than 8 months after the invasion began, 2 million Soviet prisoners of war were dead. The men who had killed them, not individually for the most part, but through the specific mechanism of organized neglect, were German soldiers. The men who had watched them die, through the wire, from the roads, from the villages adjacent to the camps, were German soldiers too, and Soviet civilians, and the occasional foreign correspondent whose reports did not reach audiences that could act on them. The men who would remember were on both sides. The Soviet soldiers who learned what was happening to their captured comrades drew conclusions that would shape how they fought for the rest of the war. Surrender to the Germans had always been dangerous. By the winter of 1941, it was known, among the soldiers of the Red Army, to be something close to a death sentence. This knowledge did not uniformly produce resistance. Desperation and exhaustion continued to produce surrenders throughout the war. But it shaped the specific quality of Soviet resistance at moments when German forces expected it to collapse. The German soldiers who had administered, guarded, and witnessed the camps drew conclusions too. Not immediately, and not uniformly. The Eastern Front in 1941 and 1942 was a place where what was happening could be rationalized in ways that the participants found sufficient. The ideology had prepared them for it. The scale of the fighting made individual moral calculation feel irrelevant. The authority that had ordered it was the same authority that was winning. By 1944, the authority was no longer winning, and the rationalizations were wearing thin. What German soldiers knew, by the spring of 1945, about what their army had done to Soviet prisoners was not something they had to be told. They had been there, and what they knew about what Soviet soldiers would do to German prisoners, given the opportunity, was a calculation they could make themselves. The calculation was not complicated. The Soviet Union's decision not to sign the Geneva Convention had a second consequence that Stalin had not intended. It gave the Germans a legal pretext for the policy they had already decided to implement. The directives of March 1941 did not require the absence of the convention. Hitler's ideological framework had already determined how the war in the East would be fought, and the treatment of prisoners was one expression of that framework among many. But the absence of Soviet signature provided the Wehrmacht's lawyers with language that could be placed in the official record, a formal justification that distinguished the Eastern War from the Western one in ways that the institution could document. The distinction mattered to the institution. It mattered less to the men in the fields. What the Soviet soldiers who survived German captivity carried home, those few who survived, who were liberated by the Red Army's advance or who escaped and made their way back through the lines, was not a legal analysis. It was a physical memory. The cold, the hunger, the specific texture of organized abandonment. The guards who walked the perimeter and did not intervene when men died. The food that came in quantities calculated to extend life for weeks rather than months. The absence of the International Red Cross, whose access to Soviet prisoner camps the Germans declined to permit. The survivors talked. Not always, and not to everyone. The Soviet state regarded men who had surrendered with a suspicion that made survival in captivity a complicated credential to carry home. Stalin's Order No. 270 of August 1941 had declared surrender an act of treason, and soldiers who returned from German captivity could find themselves investigated, imprisoned, or shot by the same state they had been fighting for. But the information moved anyway, through letters, through men who had escaped, through the particular efficiency with which armies transmit knowledge that bears on survival. By 1943, every Soviet soldier at the front knew what German captivity meant. The knowledge was not statistical. It was not a percentage or a probability. It was a set of images, specific and concrete, that had been passed from man to man until they were as present as the landscape. On the German side, the knowledge moved differently. German soldiers at the front in 1941 and 1942 were winning. The camps full of Soviet prisoners were, from the perspective of a fighting man in an advancing army, the visible evidence of victory. Large numbers of defeated enemies removed from the battlefield. The moral weight of what was happening to those prisoners was available to anyone who looked directly at it. But looking directly at it was not required. And the psychology of a winning army is not disposed toward the examination of its own conduct. By 1943, the psychology had changed. Stalingrad had produced a German defeat on a scale that the earlier victories had made unimaginable. The Sixth Army, 300,000 men, had been destroyed. The survivors who entered Soviet captivity in February 1943 joined a prisoner population whose conditions, while different from the deliberate extermination that characterized German handling of Soviet prisoners, were nevertheless brutal enough to produce mortality rates that the Wehrmacht's own records documented. A German prisoner in Soviet hands had approximately a 35% chance of dying before repatriation. The soldiers who learned this, from the reports that filtered back through the front, from the accounts of men who had escaped Soviet captivity, from the specific silence of units that had surrendered in the East and from which no word had returned, were the soldiers who would face the choice of where to surrender in the spring of 1945. They had been given 2 years to think about it. The answer, when the time came, was not a decision made in the moment. It was the conclusion of a calculation that had been running since Stalingrad, made concrete by the specific geography of the collapsing front and the specific knowledge of what waited on each side. To the west, Americans. To the east, what they had done. The German soldier of 1945 knew things that the German soldier of 1941 had not known. He knew them from letters, the specific, careful letters that men write when they are describing something they cannot fully say, that arrive at home and are read between the lines by people who understand the code. He knew them from the accounts of men who had been captured and escaped, whose stories circulated through units with the speed that armies reserve for information bearing on survival. He knew them from the absence of information, from the units that had gone into Soviet captivity and from which nothing had returned. No letters, no Red Cross notifications, no accounts of men who had made it to a camp and were waiting out the war. Silence, in the specific context of the Eastern Front, was its own kind of information. The German propaganda apparatus had spent 4 years constructing a particular image of the Soviet enemy, subhuman, barbaric, incapable of the civilized conduct that the laws of war required. The image had served its purpose in 1941, when it was needed to motivate men to fight a war that Hitler's ideology demanded. By 1945, it had become, in the specific context of surrender, a liability. If the image was accurate, the consequences of falling into Soviet hands were what the image implied. The soldiers who had absorbed the propaganda had been given, in it, a reason to fight to the end rather than surrender, not because they believed in the war, but because they feared what ending it would mean. This was not entirely propaganda. The Red Army of 1945 was not the same institution as the Red Army of 1941. 4 years of a war that had cost 27 million Soviet lives had produced in its soldiers a quality of motivation that went beyond ideology or discipline. The German invasion had destroyed cities, villages, families. The soldiers advancing into Germany in the spring of 1945 were, many of them, men who had seen what the German army had done to their country, their towns, the people they had known. The specific fury that this produced was not uniform. There were Soviet commanders who maintained discipline, who shot men who committed atrocities, who treated German prisoners according to standards that the situation did not require, but it was present, and it expressed itself in ways that the German soldiers at the front could observe and report. The reports reached the men who needed to make decisions. A German soldier facing encirclement in the spring of 1945 had, in principle, 3 options. He could fight to the end. He could surrender to the Soviets. He could attempt to reach the Western Allied lines and surrender to the Americans or British. The first option was what the Nazi state demanded. Hitler's orders through the final months of the war were consistent on this point, and the machinery of enforcement, including the SS field courts that shot men found retreating without orders, was still functioning. The second option was what geography often made the only immediately available choice. The third option was what most German soldiers, given any possibility of achieving it, chose. The knowledge that made the third option compelling was not distributed through any official channel. The German army did not issue pamphlets explaining that American captivity was survivable and Soviet captivity was not. The information moved the way soldiers' information always moves, through the informal networks of men who talk to each other, who share what they know, who pass along the specific intelligence that bears on whether they will live or die. What the soldiers knew about American captivity came partly from the Western Front's own history. Germans who had surrendered to Americans in North Africa, in Sicily, in France, had in some cases sent letters home. The letters described food, shelter, medical attention, treatment that was recognizable as the treatment the Geneva Convention required. The Red Cross had access to the camps. The camps were not comfortable, but they were survivable. The contrast with what the soldiers knew about Soviet captivity did not require elaboration. By the spring of 1945, the decision of where to surrender had become, for hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, the most important tactical problem they faced. More important in the final weeks of the war than any question of ground to be held or position to be defended. The ground was lost. The position was untenable. The only question that remained was which direction to walk when it was over. The Geneva Convention was a document. In the spring of 1945, it was also a geography. The line between American-held territory and Soviet-held territory was the line between 2 different legal universes, 2 different sets of expectations about what would happen to a man who put down his weapon and raised his hands. The convention did not guarantee safety. It did not prevent abuse, or the specific brutalities that frontline soldiers commit in the heat of contact, or the particular violence that exhausted men apply to prisoners when no officer is watching. But it established a framework, a set of obligations that the American military had institutionalized in its training, its procedures, and its chain of command, that made survival in captivity probable rather than uncertain. The American Army's handling of German prisoners on the Western Front had been, for most of the war, consistent with that framework. German prisoners taken in France in 1944 were processed, documented, fed, and moved to camps in Britain or the United States, where the Red Cross had access, and the mortality rate was, by the standards of the war, negligible. Less than 1% of German prisoners in American custody died before repatriation. The soldiers at the front knew this number not as a statistic, but as a pattern. the pattern of men who had surrendered to Americans and survived, whose names continued to appear in letters, whose existence was confirmed by the Red Cross notifications that reached their families. The contrast with Soviet captivity required no elaboration for men who had been on the Eastern Front. But the knowledge also had a second dimension that was specific to 1945. The German soldiers who were making their calculations in the spring of that year were not making them in a vacuum. They were making them in the context of what the Red Army had been doing as it advanced through East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania, the German territories east of the Oder that Soviet forces had been occupying since January. The accounts that came back from those territories were specific and concrete. German civilians who had fled west, soldiers who had passed through areas of Soviet occupation, men who had been briefly captured and escaped, all carried the same picture. The Red Army's advance through German civilian territory had been accompanied by violence on a scale that reflected 4 years of accumulated grievance and the specific psychology of an army that had been told, accurately, what Germany had done to the Soviet Union. Women had been raped, men had been shot, property had been destroyed not as a military measure, but as an expression of something that did not have a military name. The German soldiers processing this information were not neutral observers. They were the soldiers of the army that had created the conditions for it, the army that had killed 27 million Soviet people and was now receiving, in the territories it had built, a response proportionate to what it had done. The moral accounting was not lost on them. But the moral accounting did not change what they intended to do when the front collapsed. It reinforced it. A man who knows he is guilty of something does not surrender to the people he has wronged if he has any alternative. The specific guilt of the Eastern Front, the camps, the villages, the 2 million dead prisoners, was present in the calculations of the spring of 1945, not as an abstraction, but as a practical factor. It was one more reason, added to the fear of Soviet captivity and the knowledge of American captivity, to walk west rather than east when the moment came. The moment was coming. In April 1945, Soviet forces encircled Berlin and drove toward the Elbe. American forces halted their advance at the Elbe's western bank, a decision made at the highest levels of Allied command, reflecting agreements about occupation zones that had been negotiated months earlier. The river became the boundary. On one side, Americans, the Geneva Convention, survivable captivity. On the other, everything the calculation had been running from. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers began moving toward the river. In the last week of April 1945, approximately 80,000 German soldiers were trapped in a pine forest south of Berlin. The forest was near the village of Halbe, flat, sandy ground covered in the kind of dense conifer woodland that the Brandenburg March produced in abundance, and that offered cover without offering escape. The German Ninth Army had been encircled there by Soviet forces closing from the north and south, cut off from Berlin by the Soviet advance, and from the American lines by the width of the country between them. The men in the pocket were not the remnants of a beaten force. They were formed units, infantry divisions, artillery, armor, the specific organizational structure of an army that had not yet been destroyed, but had been rendered irrelevant by the strategic situation surrounding it. General Theodor Busse commanded the Ninth Army. Busse was a professional officer who understood his situation with the clarity that professional officers bring to problems that have no good solutions. His army was encircled. Its supply lines were cut. Berlin, which had been its operational objective, was itself surrounded and would fall within days. The Soviet forces around the pocket were not going to withdraw, and the pocket was not going to be relieved. The options available to Busse reduced in the end to two: remain in the pocket until the army was destroyed, or attempt a breakout. The direction of the breakout was not in question. West was where the Americans were. West was where the Geneva Convention applied. West was where the calculation that every soldier in the pocket had been running since Stalingrad pointed. The distance was approximately 100 kilometers, from the forest near Halba to the Elbe River, where American forces had halted on the western bank, and where the specific boundary between the two captivities was marked by the water. Between the pocket and the river, Soviet forces, in strength, who had been informed that a breakout was coming and had positioned themselves to prevent it. The breakout began on the night of April 28th. It was not an orderly military movement. The Ninth Army's attempt to fight its way west through Soviet encirclement produced the specific chaos that large formations generate when they are moving under fire through terrain that was not designed for the passage of an army. The pine forest offered no roads adequate for the vehicles that were trying to use them. The columns fragmented. Units lost contact with each other. Men moved in groups that ranged from organized battalion formations to individuals stumbling through the trees, following the sound of movement ahead. The Soviets engaged the breakout with everything available: artillery, tank fire, infantry blocking positions, the standard toolkit of an army that has encircled an enemy force and is determined to prevent its escape. The fighting in the forest and the fields around Halba was of the specific intensity that comes when one side is trying to escape and the other is trying to prevent it, when the stakes are not ground or position, but survival itself. German soldiers who were captured in the fighting were, in many cases, shot rather than processed. The accounts of survivors describe scenes that confirmed every calculation the men had been making about the difference between the two captivities. The men who could keep moving did. Approximately 25,000 of the 80,000 who began the breakout reached the Elbe. The men who reached the Elbe found Americans on the other side. The 102nd Infantry Division had halted at the river in accordance with the agreements negotiated at Yalta, the occupation zone boundaries that had divided post-war Germany between the Allied powers before the fighting had ended. The Americans were not supposed to advance further east. They were not supposed to accept the surrender of German forces that the Soviets had encircled. The agreements were clear on this point, and Eisenhower had communicated them to his commanders with the specificity that high-level political arrangements required when they were being enforced by frontline soldiers. The soldiers at the river made their own calculations. What they saw on the eastern bank was not a military formation presenting itself for formal surrender. It was men, soldiers, civilians, wounded, women with children, crossing a partially destroyed bridge, swimming the current, clinging to improvised rafts, doing whatever the river and the situation permitted to reach the western bank. Behind them, Soviet forces were firing, not always with the intention of killing everyone. Some of the firing was warning fire, some was directed at military personnel specifically, some reflected the specific confusion of a frontline situation where orders and events were moving faster than communication could manage. But the river was dangerous, and the people crossing it were crossing it under fire. The American soldiers who watched this chose, repeatedly and without orders from above, to help. They threw ropes. They waded into the shallows. They pulled men out of the current who would not have made it to the bank on their own. They processed the soldiers who arrived as prisoners, recording names, disarming, beginning the formal machinery of captivity that the Geneva Convention required, while simultaneously making space for the civilians who arrived alongside them, who were not prisoners in any legal sense, but who had followed the soldiers west for the same reasons the soldiers had. The Soviet liaison officers who were present at the crossing points protested. The agreements required that German soldiers encircled by Soviet forces be surrendered to Soviet custody. The men crossing the Elbe at Tangermünde and the other crossing points were, by the terms of those agreements, Soviet prisoners, not American ones. The Soviet officers made this argument to their American counterparts with the formal precision of men who knew they were right about the law and wrong about what was happening. The American officers acknowledged the argument and continued pulling men out of the river. The numbers at Tangermünde alone reached into the tens of thousands over the days of the crossing. The Ninth Army soldiers who had survived the breakout from Halbe were joined by soldiers from other encircled formations, by civilian refugees who had been moving west since the Soviet winter offensive in January, by the specific mixture of military and civilian that the collapse of a front produces when it coincides with the collapse of a state. A sign had been posted on the western bank by American soldiers of the 405th Infantry Regiment. It read, in German, "Das verdanken wir unserem Führer." This we owe to our Führer. The men crossing read it as they came off the bridge. None of them argued with it. The Soviet soldier who had been assigned as liaison at the crossing point spent several days watching the flow of men from east to west. He kicked at some of the Germans as they passed him, not systematically, but with the specific expression of a man who understood that the crossing was wrong by the terms of an agreement that was being violated in front of him, and who had no means of stopping it beyond the gesture. The American soldiers nearby paid it little attention. The Germans hurrying past paid it less. They were already on the right side of the river. The numbers told the story more plainly than any individual account could. In April 1945, the Western Allies were taking German prisoners at a rate that their processing system had not been designed to handle. In the first 2 weeks of the month, American forces alone were capturing 39,000 soldiers per day. In the final 16 days of April, the daily rate peaked at 59,000. By the end of the month, more than 1.5 million German soldiers had surrendered on the Western Front in 30 days, a number that exceeded the total German prisoner population in American and British custody for the entire preceding year. On the Eastern Front in the same period, Soviet forces took approximately 800,000 German prisoners. In a theater where the fighting was heavier, the German forces more densely concentrated, and the front longer. The disproportion was not explained by the military situation alone. In the West, German units were surrendering without significant resistance. Entire divisions, formed, armed, with officers in command and organizational structures intact, were laying down their weapons and walking toward American lines in formations that looked more like organized movements than military defeats. The Ruhr Pocket, where the German Army Group B was encircled in late March, produced 317,000 prisoners and approximately 10,000 German casualties, a ratio that reflected not a battle, but a decision. The men in the pocket had chosen to surrender, and they had surrendered in the direction of the Americans who surrounded them rather than attempting to break out eastward toward the German lines that no longer meaningfully existed. In the east, German units fought with a desperation that their counterparts in the west had largely abandoned. The Berlin garrison held the city against Soviet assault for 11 days after the American crossing of the Rhine had made the military outcome of the war obvious. Formations that had no prospect of relief, no supply, and no strategic purpose continued to resist Soviet advances in ways that they did not continue to resist American advances. The difference was not morale in any abstract sense. It was the specific calculation of what surrender to each side meant, a calculation that produced different behaviors from the same army in the same week. Eisenhower was aware of the numbers and their implications. His decision to halt at the Elbe, the decision that had placed American forces on the western bank while Soviet forces closed from the east, creating the specific geography that the German calculation was exploiting, had been made for political reasons that were not primarily military. The occupation zone boundaries negotiated at Yalta had assigned Berlin and the territory east of the Elbe to the Soviet zone. Racing the Soviets to Berlin, as Churchill had urged, would have placed American forces in territory they had already agreed to hand over, at the cost of casualties that Eisenhower's military judgment found unjustifiable. The decision was defensible. Its consequences were not comfortable. The halt at the Elbe created the boundary that hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were crossing in defiance of the agreements that had drawn it. The Americans who were accepting those soldiers, in technical violation of the Yalta arrangements, with Soviet liaison officers watching and protesting, were doing so because the alternative was to return men to a captivity that their own soldiers could observe the quality of, in real time, from the western bank of a river. The American commanders at the crossing points did not frame their decisions in those terms. They framed them in the practical language of soldiers managing a situation that was moving faster than higher headquarters could address. But the practical decisions accumulated into a pattern, a systematic preference, expressed in thousands of individual choices, for the convention over the agreement. The convention was older than the agreement. It described obligations that the American military had internalized over decades. The agreement was 6 months old and was being violated, from the American perspective, by the sight of men crossing a river under fire to reach a captivity they had chosen over the alternative. The numbers continued to rise. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The surrender was signed at Reims, in the headquarters of the Supreme Allied Expeditionary Force, by German General Alfred Jodl, a man who had spent the preceding week attempting to negotiate a partial surrender to the Western Allies only, which would have allowed German forces in the East to continue fighting the Soviets while laying down their arms in the West. Eisenhower had refused. The surrender had to be unconditional and simultaneous on all fronts. Jodl signed. The partial surrender that he had tried to negotiate was, in its logic, the formal expression of exactly what German soldiers had been doing informally for weeks, treating the Western and Eastern fronts as two different wars with two different outcomes, and attempting to end one while continuing the other. The attempt failed at the level of high command. At the level of the individual soldier, it had already largely succeeded. In the days between Germany's effective military collapse and the formal surrender, the movement of German forces westward continued and accelerated. Units that had been holding positions against Soviet forces dissolved and moved. Soldiers who had been fighting in Czechoslovakia, in Austria, in the eastern reaches of Germany drove, marched, or walked toward the American lines, with the specific urgency of men who understood that the window was closing. The formal end of the war would transfer custody of German prisoners to the occupation zone authorities, which meant that men who reached American lines after May 8th might find themselves returned to the Soviets under the terms of the agreements. Some of them made it, some did not. The Americans processed what arrived. By the end of May, the total number of German soldiers in Western Allied custody, American, British, French, exceeded 5 million. The Soviet Union held approximately 3 million. The disproportion, given the relative sizes of the fronts and the relative intensity of the fighting, was a direct expression of the calculation that German soldiers had been running since Stalingrad. The men in American custody were not comfortable. The processing system had been overwhelmed by numbers it was not designed to handle, and the conditions in the Rhein-Wiesenlager, the large open-air camps established to hold the flood of surrendering Germans, were, in the spring of 1945, inadequate by the standards of the convention that had attracted the men to them. Food was short, shelter was limited, men died of exposure and illness at rates that post-war historians would document with some controversy, but they were alive, and they were not being returned to the East. The Soviet Union pressed through the diplomatic channels that the Allied Control Council provided for the repatriation of German prisoners taken by the Western Allies who were properly Soviet prisoners under the Yalta agreements. The Americans acknowledged the obligation in principle and honored it selectively in practice, returning some, retaining others, allowing the passage of time to render the question increasingly academic as the political relationship between the former Allies deteriorated into what would become the Cold War. The German soldiers who had crossed the Elbe at Tangermunde were not repatriated. They had made their calculation correctly. The convention had been where they thought it was. The river had been the boundary they had calculated it to be. The Americans on the western bank had behaved as the accounts circulating through the front since 1943 had said they would. The war ended. The prisoners went home, most of them eventually in the years that followed. The men who had surrendered to the Soviets came home later, some of them much later, some not at all. The last German prisoners of war were repatriated from the Soviet Union in 1955, 10 years after the surrender at Reims. The calculation had been correct. The Geneva Convention of 1929 was a document about obligations. It specified what a capturing power owed to the men it had taken: food at defined caloric minimums, shelter adequate to the climate, medical care proportionate to what was available to the capturing power's own forces, protection from violence and public curiosity, the right to communicate with family through the International Red Cross. It did not specify enforcement mechanisms. It did not create an international authority capable of compelling compliance. It operated in practice through the institutional cultures of the armies that had signed it, through the training, the procedures, and the chain of command that translated a document into behavior. The American Army had translated it into behavior. Not perfectly. The Rheinwiesenlager were evidence that the translation had limits when the numbers exceeded what the system could manage. Not consistently. There were American soldiers who shot prisoners, who committed the specific crimes that exhausted men commit when authority is temporarily absent. But institutionally, systematically, in the aggregate pattern of millions of individual interactions between American soldiers and German prisoners over 4 years of war, the convention had been honored in a way that produced an outcome measurable in survival rates. Less than 1% of German prisoners in American custody died before repatriation. This number, not announced, not advertised, not the subject of any propaganda campaign directed at German soldiers, had nevertheless reached the front. It had moved through the informal channels by which armies share survival information, arriving at the calculations of men who needed to know it without any official mechanism for its transmission. The convention was not a promise the Americans had made to the Germans. It was an obligation the Americans had accepted before the war began, directed at any prisoner of any nationality, and honored with enough consistency that its practical meaning was legible to the men whose lives depended on understanding it. The Soviet Union had not signed the convention. This too had reached the front, not as a legal fact, not as a citation from an international treaty, but as a pattern of experience. The pattern was what happened to men who surrendered to Soviet forces, documented in the accounts of those who had escaped, confirmed by the silence of those who had not. The pattern was also what had happened to Soviet prisoners in German hands, a history that the German soldiers on the Eastern Front had participated in, and that they understood, from the specific knowledge of participants, to have produced a response. The convention was not the only factor in the calculation German soldiers were making in the spring of 1945. Geography mattered. Not every soldier had the option of reaching American lines. Military organization mattered. Units with officers capable of leading a coherent movement westward had better options than soldiers who were isolated and exhausted. The specific moment of collapse mattered. Men who surrendered before the front disintegrated had different choices than men who were overrun in their positions. But for the hundreds of thousands of soldiers who had any choice at all, the convention was the factor that determined the direction they walked. It had been written in 1929 by diplomats who were trying to codify the minimum obligations of civilization in a context they hoped would never recur. It had been signed by governments that could not anticipate the specific war that would test it. It had been institutionalized by armies that had no way of knowing that the test would come in the form of 5 million men choosing, simultaneously, the direction of their surrender. It had worked, not because it was enforced, not because the Germans had been given any guarantees, but because the American army had honored it consistently enough, over long enough, that the men who needed to believe in it had been given evidence sufficient to act on. The evidence was the 1%. The last German prisoner of war held by the Soviet Union came home in 1955. His name was Friedrich Stark, a soldier from Bavaria who had been captured in the final weeks of the war and spent 10 years in Soviet camps before repatriation. He was one of approximately 35,000 Germans released in that final wave, men whom the Soviet Union had held for a decade after the surrender, in camps whose conditions had improved from the wartime catastrophe, but which remained, by any standard the convention would have recognized, inadequate. The men who had crossed the Elbe in April 1945 had been home for 9 years by the time Stark returned. The comparison was not statistical. It was the specific human weight of a decision made in a pine forest south of Berlin, or on a road in Silesia, or at any of the 100 other points where the front had collapsed and men had chosen a direction. The men who had chosen correctly, who had reached the American lines, who had crossed the river, who had found themselves on the western bank when the shooting stopped, had lived their post-war lives in the years that the men who had not chosen correctly were spending in Soviet captivity. The decision had been made on the basis of information, Not complete information. The men crossing the Elbe in April 1945 did not know precisely what awaited them on either side. They had accounts, patterns, calculations. They had the specific absence of information about men who had gone into Soviet captivity and not been heard from. They had the specific presence of information about men who had surrendered to Americans and survived. The information was imperfect and informal, and had traveled through channels that no intelligence service had organized or authorized. It was enough. The story of the spring of 1945 is usually told as a military story. The advance of Allied armies, the collapse of German resistance, the formal surrender at Reims. These things happened, and they were decisive. But running alongside the military story was a different story. About 5 million individual decisions made by men who were not consulting maps or receiving orders, but were applying, under the specific pressure of imminent capture, the information they had accumulated about what the two available captivities meant. The information pointed west. The Geneva Convention had not been designed as a strategic instrument. Its authors in 1929 had been thinking about individual soldiers in individual camps, about the minimum obligations of humanity in circumstances they hoped were exceptional. They had not been thinking about the collective behavior of an army in collapse, about the way that consistent institutional behavior over years produces a reputation that functions as a strategic asset, about the specific military consequence of being the army that honors its obligations to prisoners in a war where the other army does not. The consequence was 5 million men walking west. Not because the Americans were better people. Not because the Germans had earned better treatment. The men crossing the Elbe included soldiers of formations that had committed the specific crimes on the Eastern Front that had produced the Soviet response they were fleeing. The convention did not distinguish between the guilty and the innocent among its beneficiaries. It applied to prisoners, regardless of what those prisoners had done. This was its strength. It was also its moral complexity. The document that had attracted 5 million men to American captivity was the same document that their army had refused to apply to the men they had taken. General Busa, who had led the Ninth Army's breakout from Halba, was captured by American forces and released in 1948. He lived until 1986. He wrote his memoirs. He described the breakout with the professional precision of a soldier assessing an operation. He did not describe what the men he had led were running from. He did not need to. Everyone who had been there already knew.